In today's episode, we review how the changes in attacking instructions will affect your players on the field with live examples. Stay tuned. Hey guys, so today we'll talk about how different changes you make in your attacking instruction will actually affect the way that your players space themselves and behave on the pitch in a real scenario. We'll start off with probably one of the most common sets of tactical setting that most teams will have. And this will be across both Master League and My Club, as the teams that you're playing against will generally have the same types of setting and behavior. So the two teams I'm using are Newcastle to demonstrate how the players are going to behave when I make my tactical adjustments through attacking instructions. And I'm going to play against Manchester City, mostly because they're a really good example of a tough team you're going to come up against. And you'll see how they move around. They'll be able to chase down my players and give you a good idea of how the instructions behave when you're actually playing against a good team. Now I am in training mode, but the difficulty is still set to superstar. So Manchester City will still be a very good team and difficult to play against. All right, so our first example here is using possession with short pass, an attacking zone that's driving through the center, and the maintain formation setting. Every single example I show you will have a medium support range, which is basically 5 out of 10. And that's so that variable doesn't skew the results of the other things that I'm changing to demonstrate how players behave. At the end, I'll show you how support range affects the spacing of your players. And I'll explain why this is not as important when we're changing the other settings when we get there. All right, so as we look at using the possession, short pass, center, maintain options, we're really gonna focus on the first two, possession and short pass. And the thing that you're going to notice, firstly, is that when you play possession, your players are looking to receive the ball at their feet. And if you look really closely, you'll be able to see the player actually motion down to their feet when they're in a position where they feel like they're ready to receive the ball. It's really subtle, but before I pass, what you'll be able to see is in a lot of cases, instead of a player putting their arm up, what they'll actually do really briefly as they slow down their run is they'll motion to the floor. And that's suggesting that they're in a position to receive the ball. What this also means is they're not going to make runs. They're not going to make a lot of movement when they're doing that. And the expectation is that they're going to get a pass. And this is what they'll do all the way down the field. They'll motion to their feet. They'll stay stationary. They'll kind of stop for a second, allow you to pass the ball to them. The other player will run around them. And this cycle repeats itself. And so what you get is a very predictable and stable ability to build up the field. The other thing with possession play that's a little frustrating is even though you have really good predictability with being able to pass a ball to a player, know that they're going to be stationary, you have really good control on when they receive the ball, you're not going to get a lot of runs. You'll see in a couple cases here, players will put their hands up and expect the ball to be passed to them in more of a through ball type of way. What I found was even when you get these through ball opportunities where players put their hands up to expect a through ball, the period of time that their hands are up is much shorter than it's going to be if you're playing a counter-attacking style. Another thing I noticed is when you're playing a possession style of play, what the players are going to do is move around the player with the ball instead of getting into positions that are going to be really dangerous. And this is another really important thing to understand. When you use possession play, it's prioritizing being close to the ball carrier and getting into a good position around the ball carrier versus getting into a good position overall across the field. And so you're not going to see your players spread out and getting to super dangerous positions unless you send them on manual runs. And this is, I guess, one of the biggest factors that I felt with possession play. If you want to have possession play and also be really dangerous on the counterattack or really dangerous with very fluid forward momentum, you're going to have to do one or two things. You're either going to have to send your players on manual runs, whether it be through 1-2s or manually sending that player on a run, or you're going to have to use fluid formation. Fluid formation is a totally separate topic. I will do a video on it, but it is another way to simulate manual runs through tactics. And those are really the only two ways you're going to get really fluid play with possession style football. Otherwise, it's going to be very stop and start, very predictable, very easy to pass the ball around until you get into a congested area. But you're also not going to get these dangerous, really dynamic moves that come more from counter-attacking football that are very quick. This is very patient style. You really are going to look to break down your opponent. You need to have really strong midfielders, players that can pass the ball very well. I struggle struggled with Newcastle because they can't. But if you're going to pick this style of play, patience is going to be your thing. You're going to want to take time, break a team down, wait for your opportunity. And it's going to be frustrating because every time you lose the ball, you're then going to have to build up all over again and take more time. Now, if we take all the same variables and just change the play style to counter-attacking, what you're going to see is a very, very different style of play. What the players are looking to do is, instead of receiving the ball at their feet and stopping, the players are going to be looking to run into channels and receive the ball ahead of them. The other thing you'll notice is the movement from the back end of the field to the front end of the field is very rapid. Players are pushing as fast as they can to get into their ideal attacking positions. And the way you'll notice this the most is when you look at left backs and right backs, or left midfielders and right midfielders, because what you'll see from there is they'll immediately start to push into the opposition half of the field even before they realize that the ball's crossed midfield. In some cases, you'll see the left or right midfielders at the same attacking line as your center forwards by the time the ball crosses the halfway line. So their goal here, the major change, is that instead of waiting for you to pass the ball up the field and get into a good attacking position, the players are immediately transitioning from their defensive position into their attacking position, regardless of where the ball is. What this creates is a lot of fluid dynamic motion, and it creates a lot of panic on the defensive side. Now, the challenge here with this is, because there's so much movement and because it's so fluid, it becomes a lot harder to make accurate passes. It becomes a lot harder to hit players on the run because your player's moving as they're most likely receiving the ball in a position where it's been passed as a through ball or passed ahead of them. So they're coming onto the ball and they have to then control the ball and then make a pass or take the ball on in stride. And then the other players are also moving. And so they're moving in sometimes unpredictable positions that mean if you make a through pass or a regular pass, there's a higher percentage of chance that you make an error. And this is a real important thing to understand. Counter-attacking football is super dangerous. It allows you to move up the field quickly. It allows you to create these dynamic situations, but it also increases the chance of making an error as you pass the ball up the field. With possession football, it's very predictable and very stable, and it allows you to maintain your formation all the way up the field. And it also allows that if there's a loss of possession around the halfway line or as you move into the attacking third, your players aren't in bad positions to recover. So the decisions that you make, and this really goes across all of these things that I'm going to cover, but the decisions that you make on the attacking side of the football will actually have an impact on the defensive side, because if you're making a decision to go with possession-based football and you lose the ball as you're moving up the field, your players are closer together, they're well positioned, they're using less stamina, and so you can recover more easily. If you're using counter-attacking, your players are bombing forward and they're more dangerous as they create positions as they're moving, but then they also move out of their defensive position. So you leave yourself open to counterattack. And that's the other interesting thing here. I think possession formations versus possession formations, it's basically two people playing really safe. Counter formations versus counter formations lead to these crazy end-to-end breaks. And so what you choose, you should also think about which formation your opponent has. And if they're counterattacking, you should consider whether or not your counterattack is going to be better than theirs, or you should shift to a possession-based formation and vice versa. So if we take a look now at a lot of the same variables, but instead of short pass, we're going to move to long pass. And so we'll start with possession, and I'll tell you what I see as the major difference between short pass and long pass. In long pass, what players are doing is they are separating themselves more regularly from the defensive player. And I thought this was really interesting because the concept of long pass is bomb the ball all the way up the field, and then players get into aggressive positions to support the other player that has the ball. But what was really interesting is when you look at the positions that the players in long pass are taking up, whereas with short pass, defenders were able to make plays on the ball fairly regularly. And I think this is because with short pass, you're really focused on getting yourself into a good position to receive the pass from the player with the ball, but it does create more opportunity for a defensive player to position themselves in a good position to defend it as well. Because in a lot of cases, you have to stay close to the player with the ball or become stationary. And with long pass, when the ball was played, what I found was that in a lot of cases, guys would have somewhere between 2 and potentially 5 or 6 feet when they were in a position to receive a ball from the defender. So they would make space for themselves as you're moving the ball up the field. Even in possession play, they would make space for themselves to receive the ball so that when they received the ball, the player wasn't right on top of them. Now, what's interesting here is this works as you're moving the ball up the field. But when you get into the box, it becomes a lot more difficult to manage, because as players start to spread themselves out, it then becomes a lot more difficult to break a team down when you're in the box. And this is, I think, one of the major considerations that you need to have if you choose to have a long pass play style, whether it be possession or counterattacking. It's great to move the ball up the field, but when you get up the field, it then becomes more difficult to break a team down if you're passing around the box. Your players are making a lot more movement. They're trying to get further away from the defensive players. They're trying to get into a position where they can receive the ball and not get mobbed immediately. And what that then means is it's a challenge to play the ball in very intricate ways, and everything is a little telegraphed. It becomes very easy to defend this play style when you're in the final third of the field. But if you have really strong players, or you have players that can beat their man one-on-one, I think this is a really attractive play style, because if you have a strong player, you can pass the ball into their feet. When the defender rushes up on them, they can hold the player off and they potentially can spin that player, or they can attract a second or potentially third defender that allows another player to get more space. So there is an ability to do something differently than if you were playing a short pass style. The other thing is, if you are really good in using skills or beating a man one-on-one, then this gives you another option too, because you can pass it out to a wing player. They can receive the ball, and then you can have a half second to think about what skill you're going to do or how you're going to beat that man. And I actually use this a lot in Master League. On the wings, if you're using long pass, you can receive the ball and cut in, and in the time that you receive the ball and cut in, the player's on top of you, and you can genuinely beat your first man if you time it right. And a lot of it's driven because of the spacing of long pass. So if we move to long pass counter, this is where it gets kind of crazy. So as you move the ball up the field, you now get this situation where you've got all these players bombing forward. They're spreading themselves out from defender, but they're running into each other's channels and creating a very chaotic environment. You have the same issues with counter, where people are moving quickly, you're receiving the ball on the move, you're passing while you're running, so you're creating inaccuracies. And then to add to that, you've got long pass, where players are trying to separate themselves from defenders, so they have to change their trajectories, they have to move in different directions. And so you get this combination of things that creates a really fluid football environment and dangerous football environment as you're attacking, but then also gives an opportunity for a lot of breakdowns. And this is where, if you're playing this play style with counterattacking and long pass, it can get really frustrating, because you're making these plays, you're getting the ball past halfway, and the second you start to pass into the attacking third, it gets broken down, and all of a sudden the other team's on the break. And this is how you can concede some really easy, frustrating goals. And so you have to be really careful, if you're going to play this play style, that you account for plays being broken down, so that when you pass the ball and you lose it in midfield, and your two left backs are already up by your center forwards, or your wingers are past your center forwards, and your attacking midfielders and center midfielders have already pushed forward, you can be caught in a situation where you literally have two defenders defending 3 or 4 opposition players that are running at. And so this can be a real challenge. It's very effective if you are trying to move the ball upfield and you can control it. You have players that can control the ball as they receive it, they can pass well, strong enough to hold up the ball in certain situations, give your guys a second to figure out where you want to pass it to next. But if you have a team like I do, starting out with Newcastle, it becomes really difficult. And you're going to feel this a lot in the lower divisions. You're going to be really tempted to use this because it allows you to move the ball very quickly and go buy a player that has 90 speed and 90 acceleration and break the line down. But I promise you, 99% of the time, they are not going to be able to break the line down purely based on pace. You're going to have to use the long pass and the counter to your advantage from a formation perspective. And the way that you are going to leverage this successfully is actually to beat the opposition's formation by getting more numbers quickly up front than the opposition. So if you're going to use a counter long pass, what you really need to do is make sure you basically have 6 attacking players going into the box or going into the opposition's half at once, because that's going to outnumber whatever your opposition has going in to defend their half. And so you have to be really careful with this one. It can really help you and be really successful. But from what I've seen, when you combine the counter and the long pass, you create these situations situations where you can move the ball up the field and players are getting open, but because you can't control it, because it takes you a second to bring the ball down, because your other players are running around and your players internally are trying to find space, it can become really hard without good players to run this play style successfully. However, if you have really good players that can control the ball, that can move quickly, that can turn, that are agile or strong, this can be potentially the most dangerous combination of playing styles, because you can move the ball quickly up the field, players are generating space for themselves, then they can control the ball, and then they have a chance to get into one-on-one situations, or a chance to hold up the ball, protect it, attract a defender or two, and lay it off, and you can score for fun. So you really have to take a look at your team and determine, can they play this playing style successfully? And yes, in the lower divisions, a lot of people play this playing style, but it's more because they want to get the ball up and then create chaos, and that's what this does. But if you're trying to manage that chaos, you can really only do it with good players. All right, so if we move forward and take a look at a lot of the same variables, possession, short pass, but instead of center, we're going to go with wide. And what you'll see when you switch it from center to wide, in all of the previous examples, my guys are moving into the center of the field to receive the ball. When you switch it to wide, what you have is the channels will change. Instead of drifting into center, they'll drift wide. And what you can see is as you move it from side to side, it's not just the wingers that will stay more wide. You'll also notice the strikers will drift wide, or the defenders will drift wide to receive the ball. And so really what it does is it creates more players on that side. So, you know, when I played center, there'd be more players in the center becomes more congested. What you find as if you do this and you play wide, it will give you 2-3 guys on the wing, even if they're centrally assigned players. They'll drift out to the wing. And so you get a lot more wing play, and you get a lot more isolations in the center. And so think about this from the aspect of creating isolation. So if you want players to be isolated in the center, then you use the wide setting, because it means that more of your players are going to drift wide, and therefore more of the defenders are going to drift wide. If you want your players isolated on the wing, then you can play through the center, which means that the wing is going to be left more unmanaged by the opposition. Now, the opposition, if they're smart, if they see that you're playing wide, they have a defensive setting that allows them to show you center or show you wide as well. But this choice is going to dictate the way that your build-up play happens, where your build-up play happens. And what you'll notice is if you have really good midfielders that can shoot from distance, playing wide gives them the ability to get isolated as they run up into the box or the attacking third. And it does become harder to manage. And it's the same way where if you play central and you have guys that you want to cut out from the wing with isolation that are going to come from deep, so this would be more of your right backs and your left backs, it would give them more space as they run up. So it's really the area of the field where you want to put the most players, where you're going to do your most exchanges or interplays, and it leaves the other sides isolated. And so this is really going to depend on your style of football, but it could also be one of the things that you really consider. If you're playing a team and you're finding it really hard to break that team down, this is one of the easiest settings that you can change to break a team down, because most likely what's happening is if you're really struggling passing the ball through the middle and you keep losing it, switch this setting. Don't change anything else about your formation, just switch this setting, because what it will do is allow you to build the ball up in the same way, or build the play up in the same way that you have traditionally been building it up, but it will change the way the players move down the field as far as where they drift off to. And what you'll find is those areas that you previously were comfortable with building play through then become more open. And so even though there's less players there, you can more naturally then move the ball into those areas, and it changes the dynamic of the defense as well. It's a little confusing for the defense. So it gives you an opportunity, at least until they change their tactics to defend it, it gives you an opportunity to take them by surprise. So this is really about the area where you want the most of the build-up play or most of your players to come support you in, but it also will be where most of the defense comes to defend in. And so you can think about it one of two ways, where you want to move your attack through, or where you want to distract and then leave other skill players open to do things like long shots or isolations or one-on-one. And so if we look at the same thing where we look through the center, you'll see again, as you move towards the wing or towards your center forwards, there will be players coming towards the middle. They're magnetized towards the middle. And so a lot of your options to pass the ball will be in the middle. I think playing center is a lot harder to pass the ball through. I think in general terms, it's easier to get the ball up the field, and it's easier to create chances, especially if you have have wingers or good wing players when you use the wide attacking zone. I think when you use the center attacking zone, there's so many settings that a defense can use to stack the middle. They can swarm the box, they can have a deep defensive line, they can have multiple defensive midfielders. There's so many ways to shut down the center attacking zone, whereas there's not as many ways to shut down the wide attacking zone. But as you can see here, when you pass center, it just moves everyone into the center of the field. And you can see all of the opposition players are just stacked in the center of the field. And so it just brings additional numbers. Now your formation also comes into play. If you're playing a 2-2-2 where you have two center midfielders, two attacking midfielders, two strikers, then maybe that works for you. And you need to play center because all of your players are there anyway. But if you have any wing players, playing center can be a challenge. So maybe that's the decision you need to make. Are you going to have wing players or players that are going to bomb down the wings? If you want support for those players, you need to play wide. If you're going to have your play and your players focused in the center, then you need to play center. So the next thing we'll take a look at is the difference between maintain formation and flexible formation. And this one's actually really important. So all the examples up until now, you've seen maintain formation. And what maintain formation does is it basically means that as you play, players are generally going to stay in their areas as is listed on your formation chart or your tactics chart. And so the way that you lay out your formation, if you're doing 4-4-2, for example, and you have a left winger and a right winger, they're not going to move centrally into the field unless you've given them specific instructions to do so, or you're controlling them and you force them into the center of the field. But when you have flexible positioning on, what you'll see is that as you move your players around the field and you exchange with them, when you move into different areas, those players will essentially switch positions and occupy the space that was previously occupied or is supposed to be occupied by the player playing that position that is now occupying the space of the player that you just moved into their position for. So I know it can be a little confusing, but if you just look and see what happens as we move to the wing, you'll see the wing players move into the center of the field. And so by kind of motioning towards them, you'll see a point where as you motion towards them and then move into their zone of space or their zone of control, they'll realize that and then they'll take up a position in and around the zone that's unoccupied. Now it's very similar to something like wing rotation, where if you move out to the wing, the player that's on the wing will move into the same space that you have. So you can force this with the maintain formation positioning. But what this will allow you to do is have all of these interchanges as you move up the field. And so where this is really good with is this is better if you're playing a possession or a short passing formation. And in some cases, short passing counter formation, because what you want to do is you still want to have that short passing mentality of someone being available and kind of moving in a way where you can still pass to them. If you play long pass, they'll just bomb out and you might not be able to get the pass to them. But if you're playing short pass plus flexible, it gives you a lot more options and it creates a lot of dynamic interchanges that allow you to just make plays that you wouldn't be able to make plays any other way. The other thing is if you're playing counters, when you move towards another player, especially in attacking, it will force that player to then change the direction or change their trajectory, and that can create some really good short passing counter attacking options. With possession play, if you have a player like Messi or somewhere where you can kind of move around the field and dribble and beat players, when you start to move into this space of another player, that then creates a little bit of unpredictability for the defenders, even if you're playing possession short pass, that allows you to make very dynamic exchanges, and then you can add in your manual runs or your 1-2 runs, and it further kind of makes the play more dynamic while still being able to maintain a overall formation and consistency in passing and things like that. So flexible can be really, really good if that's what you're trying to create. If you're trying to create this dynamic exchange as you move down the field, as you move into space. The downside of flexible is that you can find yourself with players that you've moved into a specific space because of making some other movement or passing the ball and, at some time where a player has interchanged with another player, and that player then is not built built to execute the function of the player that was initially supposed to be there. And where you see this most is either on the wing, where you move into a central position from the wing. The central player takes up a position on the outside of the wing, and then you need to cross the ball, and that central player isn't good at crossing, right? Whereas the wing player is. Or you see it a lot when you move a player into an attacking position, where you move them ahead of the center forward, and the center forward will step back into a midfield position or a wing position or an attacking midfield position, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in the box shooting with a central midfielder who has finishing of 70 versus your assigned striker who has finishing of 85, right? Something like that. That's where you can get yourself into trouble with flexible, where if you have players that aren't well-rounded, you can't leverage flexible enough, because what you'll find is the players that aren't well-rounded end up in positions where you actually need them to be good at a specific thing, and they're not good at that thing, and that's where there's a little bit of challenge. But if you have a team where it's either like a total football team, or where you have players in attacking positions that can dribble, that can pass, that can shoot, and they have very balanced stats, flexible can be really, really exciting and interesting and very dangerous, because in every situation you have a player that can make an impact in that position that they're moving into, but then you also have defenders discombobulated because they're constantly chasing these players that are moving positions, and their assignments can get screwed up. And if especially if you have center forwards or defensive midfielders that are assigned to marking or tight marking or something like that, when you do flexible positioning, because a defender is assigned to mark a specific player like a striker or a winger or an attacking midfielder, when you introduce the flexible positioning, now they're forced to track that player potentially all the way into midfield, and you can drag a midfielder into the box that is not marked by an assigned defender, and now you've got a central midfielder defending a central midfielder, which makes it a lot easier for you to get a shot off and goal, or beat someone with skill or something like that. So you have to consider your team a lot when you're using flexible, but if you have the right players, it can be really, really dangerous. And then just a quick example of what happens when you're not using flexible. So you'll see in this, it's a very rigid, as we use the possession, short pass, center, maintain. The only thing we changed was the flexible formation versus the maintain formation, and you can see that as you move up the field here, it's very, very rigid. Players are staying in their position, and it's very different than the previous example where you were seeing a lot of interchanges. And again, this is very good if you have players, like assigned strikers who are just that good. Like, for example, if you have Harry Kane, you don't want Harry Kane dropping off to the wing, right? Or Lewandowski or someone like that. You don't want them in positions where they're useless. So maintain formation is when you have players that you absolutely always want to be in that position because they're really good at that position and they're experts. And the other thing is, if you take a look at defenders and you look at someone who's a defensive midfielder or a center back or right back, if you have flexible versus maintain, you can find yourself in situations where you've got your defensive midfielder defending Mbappe as he's bombing down because you exchanged a position with your center back, right? And again, you can get into a lot of trouble because of those type of assignments if you have flexible. If you have flexible, it can create situations on the counterattack where if you lose the ball and your defensive players are out of position because they've taken up another position of an attacking player because you've come back into your half or something like that, you can get caught out. And that's where, again, if you use maintain formation, your players are always in the right places generally on the field, where if you use flexible, it can be very advantageous, but it can also be very, very dangerous. So it's just more risky, but it does create more chances. So the only component we haven't spoken about here yet is support range. And support range is kind of an interesting thing. So you'll see two examples of it here. So firstly, I'm going to set support range down to 1 out of 10. And that is supposed to be the closest that players will come together. And what you'll see when I set that support range is that as players move up the field, they'll generally stay a little closer. Now, with support range, you kind of have to mix it with the playstyle you're using. So if you use short pass, which is the example I'm using for both of these tests, what you'll see from a support range perspective is having a lower support range is generally better. And there is a little bit of a noticeable difference. But if you're using long pass, then having a longer support range might be better. It really depends on what type of other settings you have, and then it depends on what type of players you have as well. Having a support range 1 out of 10 gives me a lot of opportunities to make short passes, giving a higher percentage of a player being close enough where I can make quicker passes, quicker movements, but it doesn't really guarantee it. The other formation settings that you use will also push and pull players closer to you. And then the opposition and the way they're defending will also push and pull players closer or further away. And so your support range is just kind of a default. When you have the opportunity to find a specific distance or space, that's what you do when you have time. But if you're making quick plays, quick movements, and you don't have the right settings, it's less relevant. If we move to 10 out of 10, what you'll see here is at first they kind of look more spread out, but what you might notice is if you compare this to the previous support range, as my player runs up the field, as I'm closing the distance, the other players can't judge their support range as quickly as I move up the field with the ball. And so again, if you're stationary, then support range will push players out to a specific distance. So 10 out of 10 would mean that they'd stand further back away from you and give you space to isolate and things like that and do dribble moves. But the reality is, in a game, your support range isn't going to have that large of effect because you're moving with the ball, people are running around, they have to cross over lines, which means that they're going to have to disrespect the support range that you set to some level to make movements and things like that. So support range is really more about stationary and how players, when they can be cognizant of your tactics, can run around the field. But in the heat of the moment, what you'll find is support range will sometimes get lost. And so if you're doing very specific passing plays that are very structured, then I think support range will make a large difference. If you're doing chaotic counter strikes or counter attacks, then I think support range is probably a little less relevant because players are going to be further up the field anyway because of the counter attacking setting. And if you have long ball in play as well, they're going to be distancing themselves from another player, which is also going to be affecting the available support range. And so what I would say here is don't ever set it to 1 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. Pick somewhere between 3 out of 10 and 7 out of 10 and have that aligned to the other tactics that you've selected, because that's when it will be most effective, when your support range reflects the tactics that you have. And obviously the shorter support range, the more rapid or quick exchanges you can have because players are close to you, and the further away you'll be looking more at things like long balls, through balls that are more risky. So just take that into account. Set it to whatever suits your tactics best, but I don't think this makes that much of a difference. All right, so hopefully this gives you some insight. I'm also going to do a team formation analysis or tactical analysis sometime in the future where I take teams like Man City, Man United, Barcelona, break down the types of players they have, the tactics they're using, and give you guys my version of what would be best for the players they have. Because I think I've talked here about your attacking instructions, but once you figure out those instructions, you have to figure out the players that fit those instructions. Otherwise, you have to change your instructions, obviously, to fit your players. And so you have to make one decision or the other. But I'll do some additional analysis on this. Hopefully this helps. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I apologize for it being long, and I'll come back soon with the defensive instructions version of this. And I'll also cover fluid formation in a separate video that you guys must watch. All right. Thanks, guys. See you soon. Hey, guys. I'm new to YouTube, so if you like the content, please give me a like. If you like the topics, please subscribe, and always leave a comment if you can. Thanks, guys.